Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul, and we are going to continue in a pseudo part 2 of the discussion we were talking about Cold War 2.0, only now we're going to look at it from how both Europe and Russia/China sees it rather than from the United States and that part of the West. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And where do you want to begin on this?
Yeah, well, there's a number of points. There's also the politics in Europe and how that's shifting. But I think, first off, we should use the point where in the previous part, when we talked about the Lithuanian former minister who's talking about this war with Russia in 6 to 8 years. Well, the question is, it's very clear, and there's a lot of evidence that's supported out there that the US, okay, we're not saying it's ever going to happen, because we've talked about why the US can't go to war with China and how it's not going to build an alliance to be able to do anything, even to create this Asia NATO alliance to try and counter this mythical threat of China. But setting that point aside, the issue with regards to this is the US clearly has ambitions to try and contain China in the future more than containing Russia. It still harbors this delusional idea it can break China and Russia apart and have Russia as a friend and China as an enemy. Well, that's nonsensical, but setting that aside, what the United States, of course, is failing to grasp in this is that it won't get the support in Asia, and what the NATO countries are going to finance some military alliance in Asia? No, that's not going to happen. And the United States clearly can't afford to finance, and like they have, because NATO countries can't pay for Asia. Asian countries are going to go, well, even if they were in agreement with this, which they're not going to finance anything like Europe's been and be, cripple themselves economically in the process, because they can't afford to have a military alliance like that, whether they want it or don't want it. So the question is, if the US switches its attention to China and walks away from Europe and NATO, well, so then we're supposed to believe that Europe's going to then fight this war on its own against Russia, which is not going to happen. And there's these conflicting sort of ideas between some Europeans, of course, and the Americans, which the Cold War, there was all joined up thinking it was all Russia. Don't need to worry about China. China's not a problem, and we've got designs in the future to suck them into the WTO, and they'll be all come friends with us and become very westernized. Okay, that all failed. But that's one of the problems and one of the reasons why Cold War 2.0 can't work either. And then you made a point, Ken, which is absolutely critical. And that's, what's the global South itself looking like in 6 to 8 years, or whatever it might be in the future, when this supposed war with Russia happens, which ultimately would descend into a world war, and with all the consequences that will be. So if we look at the global South, what does that mean? Because by that point in time, just as a small but very obvious example, you may have amongst the Asian countries a kind of NATO alliance, which is not like NATO, but it's there to protect their interests, because the perceived threat in the future isn't going to be Russia or the United States militarily. The perceived threat can be terrorism, cyber terrorism, etc., and threats to the economies of, say, Southeast Asia, to the potentially damage done to infrastructure in these countries. So they're going to want to look after themselves and protect their interests. And if China's going to invest huge sums of money, it's going to want to look after and protect its interests, meaning its investment, basically. So Central Asia is an obvious example of this. Then the question is, so by the time we get to this point in time, the world could look in a very different situation. And if Europe wants to nail its colors to its own mast and break away on its own, by that point in time, the United States may have closed its 800 military bases around the world, gone back to being a regional power, and doesn't have this military footprint all over the world. And therefore, if that was to happen, then Europe's going to suddenly be seen to be facing off against Russia. I mean, it's going to say to China, well, we can still be friends. And China's going to go, what? So you're threatening a war with our principal ally, and you think you're going to trade normally with us? And by the way, the global South's now economically grown enormous, and we're all going to trade with each other, and Europe just gets left high and dry, and it's on its own. So that's again because there's this shift in to multipolarity, this big shift in these big economic financial poles that are going to grow and are growing all over the world, be it Africa and Southeast Asia as two obvious examples, and obviously West Asia is changing in the process as well. So these kind of factors for me, I think, make a huge difference. And it wouldn't just be ASEAN countries, it could be the Eurasian Economic Union, it'll be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Maybe in the end 30 countries join that. Maybe they decide to eventually sign some sort of Article 5 to, which in inverted commas, I'm not saying literally, but something like it to protect all their interests. So therefore the world can radically change. And this is the problem with these thoughts that go on in the heads of people in the West, is that, the world's not changed. It's the same, it's the same. We're in charge. We're the West, we're the first world countries. You're third world nations. You don't even exist. I mean, when we talk about the world, we're just talking about the West and our allies like Japan and South Korea. The rest of the world doesn't count. Well, the rest of the world more than counts. And the rest of the world's going to have a far bigger economy, far bigger say in global affairs, and will have a dominant GDP position, dominant in terms of population size. And the West is going to have to sit there and eat some serious humble pie. And that's assuming, of course, the current political structure survives. And I think we can move on to the subject of politics, but I think there are just some points, and obviously it'd be good to get your perspective on how you feel the global South will change and influence and shape, policy decisions for the United States, the UK, and of course Europe, or the kind of NATO collective as it exists now.
Yeah, there's two sides I want to look at this. One, the West is already seeing the consequences of the rise of the global South as part working with the global powers of China and Russia. Think about North Korea and Iran. Both NATO and the United States have accused them of providing weapons, missiles, drones, etc., to Russia in the fight against Ukraine. Whether this is accurate or not, to come out publicly and threaten, accuse, or name these countries means that there is a significant partnership, military partnership, between Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, etc. That's only going to expand over the next 5 years. The second thing is when you take a look at what Europe wants to do, Europe is landlocked continentally. They are no longer the colonial powers being able to, control the, as the old British Empire, where the sun never sets. Most of Europe does not have colonies that remain, whether in Southeast Asia, Africa, etc. So they're landlocked. They're not going to be able to logistically supply and be a part of anything besides just throwing fodder troops for primarily U.S. military bases in this NATO expansion. So that's completely out the window. The last thing I wanted to do is the irony, of course, what Europe is more focused on. Europe is more focused on two things. They're focused on this inane fear of Russia militarily, but they're also the fear of economically with China. Not much they can do about the second one. They can cut China off, but just like with the United States, we have such a trade deficit we don't manufacture anything. And if you think we don't manufacture anything, look what's happening to VW and pretty much every industry that's going on in Europe. They don't manufacture anything. They're under this guise of this Green New Deal and cutting off their nose to spite their face for any potential energy sources. They really are at the behest of the global manufacturers and producers. So the ones who are, in my opinion, who are coming out and screaming, oh, we've got to go after Russia and China this, really, these are yapping dogs. You know, Lithuania, as you mentioned, Poland has been one, Finland, Sweden, they rushed to get into NATO just so they could stand now, hey, we can be a yapping dog sitting on the porch because we've got NATO and the United States protecting our back. Yeah. Well, they're not going to do anything. And we're seeing behind the scenes, France and Germany, because of their economies, they are very quickly changing their tune as much as they possibly can without probably, bringing down the wrath of the United States on them. Meanwhile, well, Britain is Britain, so they're going to do what they're going to do. It doesn't matter.
You make it, yeah, and you make a good point with regards to mentioning VW and all the problems German companies are having because of their being cut off primarily from cheap Russian energy. That's one of the things. And the question is in the future, and that's a great point, what's left of the industrial base of Europe, which is rapidly diminishing? And this is why a lot of companies, like the car manufacturers in Germany, are trying to open new plants up in China and trying to find a way to expand their business and to grow the business and try and solidify their business in China, which is causing huge problems from a political standpoint, because of course the story coming out of the European Commission over the Atlanticists and in the back pocket of the US is, we have to decouple from China, and business is going, we don't know, I'm sorry, that's not happening. So the question is, in the future of this Cold War 2.0, and people don't seem to understand just how big an influence big corporations have globally. If they start getting hammered because of Cold War 2.0 policy decisions, then they're likely to rise up in unison and say enough's enough. And they may have enough clout to change things politically in their country. I'm not talking about, this isn't about removing people from office, but if big business makes enough noise, it might shift the political landscape across much of Europe, because we're not just going to be, corporations in Germany, it's all over Europe. If they begin to suffer because of policy decisions that effectively are statements that are coming out of Europe. And it's interesting, we've seen in this year quite a few European countries going to China. Italy's a great one. They left the Belt and Road, and with this claim they were severing ties, we made the point that's never going to happen. And now they kind of re-signed the Belt and Road, but it's not called the Belt and Road. It's just an economic cooperation agreement, but it's exactly the same thing. And the Spanish were recently there claiming, we need to look at these tariffs on EVs or Chinese EVs, and we need to reassess and calibrate our relationship for the benefit of both countries. So there's this dynamic shift happening inside Europe, who's recognizing the need to partner up with China more than ever, despite the decoupling which is part of this Cold War 2.0 mentality, or primarily the biggest driver, I would argue. So the question is, what applies to Russia in the future? Well, at some point, Europe's going to have cheap Russian energy, or it's in serious trouble for decades. So therefore, there has to be a realization, and maybe that's Macron's whole point, that is going to be this big shift, and a realization that Russia is part of Europe. And more importantly, we need your energy, we need your resources, and we need that relationship with you, because the word on the street is Russia's going to develop the Russian Far East, 6.5 million square kilometers, massive development. And maybe we'd like a piece of the pie. And, maybe some French corp businesses and German businesses and Italians would like to have a piece of the pie and go and work there. And you know what? They can work there. The problem they can't work there is because of ridiculous edicts about sanctions on Russia, which is crippling some businesses who've had to walk away with huge losses. And Russia's just taken these companies over literally the premises and renamed the company slightly. And they're now functioning and operating perfectly well. So there is that economic side. And then there's the political side. What happens if there's a big shift politically in Europe as Europe gets weaker economically, financially, and then the risk of what happens at the end of the Ukraine war? And we're going to revisit that from a different angle in a future podcast. I'm not going to go into what that is at this point, but that raises all these questions. What happens? Because we're starting to see some political shift with the likes of the AfD getting elected in states in Germany, or doing pretty well in states in Germany. So the question is, if that's illustrative of a broader shift politically, you might start to end up with a lot of fringe political parties who are going to turn around and say, sorry, Cold War 2.0 is off. We need strong relations with the Chinese, the Russians, and we're going to have it. And these political dinosaurs will then be kicked into the long grass and become persona non grata, and the broader consensus will change that viewpoint. So, whereas that would never have happened during the Cold War 1.0 era in any way, shape, or form, it just simply wasn't going to happen. And this is why the whole dynamic's very different. The mere mention of the word is just a word, and I think what we're doing is highlighting in this discussion why there are so many factors at play here that really renders the whole idea of what it means in a very different light to what conventional wisdom seems to think it means now, that we're going to have this world where the West is going to be lined up behind the United States, and the rest of the world's going to be lined up behind the Chinese and the Russians, and it's going to be this bipolar world. Well, for a start, it's multipolar. The Chinese and the Russians don't control the global South, and they never will. But the idea that somehow the West is going to thrive and survive on its own, we've highlighted reasons recently why Russia sanctions the West are in serious trouble. The same principles apply if you cut your nose off to spite your face with China. So these are enormous challenges. And at some point, someone in the West is going to realize this. And, even maybe in 10 years' time, I'm not saying you have to wait 10 years, but a lot of these people from what I call political dinosaurs will cease to be in office anyway. And I know people think that there's all these people controlling the world and this overarching governmental structure. Well, sorry, that's not true. And that might stick in the throat of some people, but that's reality. So politically, things will change. And if we do start to get a big shift in consensus and Trump gets elected and decides he's abandoning Europe because he's got a bit more important things to deal with, and people say that can't happen, well, it might well happen. I think there is increasingly noises from Washington about what's the benefit of NATO to us anyway. And but okay, there's a war going on at the moment, so that has to reach its logical conclusion. But in the end, we'll all pretend we're all friends again. And even there's noises coming out of the US in that regard that, Russia can't be this sworn enemy forever. So therefore, there are again all these factors in play that clearly suggest that things aren't going to move as smoothly as people seem to assume. And I always come back to this point, and Ken and I often have this discussion where we talk about where he always says history rhymes, and I know exactly what he means, and because it has done, but I think increasingly we're in an era now where I'm not saying it can't happen and it won't happen in totality, but we're in a different era where certain things may appear to rhyme, but the outcome will be very different, precisely because the world's going through this enormous kind of paradigm shift. So I'll pass it back to you, Ken, but the the final point I want to make myself is something with regards to China's perspective on NATO at the moment. And I'll emphasize what those points are and why I think it's important to mention them.
Yeah, I think the last point I was going to make, and it's interesting you mentioned about history rhyming, is take a look back at the original Cold War. It was the Soviet Union as a whole, and it was Mao's China. Now take a look. In the West, they don't refer to Russia most often as Russia. They refer to it as Putin, as if they assume he's a dictator, and everything funnels through him. It's Putin's Russia, but it's China. You know, they don't hold Xi in the same level of a dictator. They see China as a nation, a powerful nation unto itself, but they have this mindset that, and they've said it numerous times, is we're using Ukraine to try to do, especially attacking into Russian territory, to drive the population to get rid of Putin. It's all about, if we get rid of Putin, then we can control Russia and everything falls apart again. This is a mindset that has utterly destroyed both the, especially Europe and the United States in regards to their hegemony. China, I think they just don't know where to chip. They tried doing it with Hong Kong. They're trying now to do it with Taiwan, but it's just not working. The things that they did in the past just don't have the same capacity. And the one last point I want to make is we're missing one of the key aspects, and it goes back to the 1963 missile crisis. Turkey is the ultimate wild card when it comes to quote unquote Cold War 2.0 and what the future is going to be, because Turkey is that one place that has their feet in both sides of the coin. They're part of the EU, they're part of NATO, and they also are looking to join the BRICS in the multipolar world. So there's a lot of ties that have to the past, but as you mentioned, it's completely opposite and changed of what it was 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're extremely good points, and you can extrapolate that kind of thinking not just to Turkey, but other countries in Europe. I mean, Hungary's an obvious one, Slovakia, etc. So Europe doesn't have this joined up thinking even about Russia itself, and they certainly broadly do not agree with the US assessment of how to handle China. But final point I want to make is this statement basically China made with regards to NATO, and it was in the Global Times, which is a Chinese publication, and they came out and said that China calls on NATO to resign along with Stoltenberg, who's obviously replaced by the former Dutch PM Rutte, but that's a separate point. And they said that NATO is responsible for destabilizing European security, which it is. I mean, it's basically pitched it against Russia for no reason other than we need to sell arms and create, I mean, to sell arms, we need to have a bogus threat, which is Russia. It said NATO expansion has led to the Ukrainian crisis. That's a perfectly valid point. And it said the modern world does not need an alliance that under the guise of defense promotes confrontation. And they then said they summed up the 10 years of Stoltenberg, saying NATO spending's increased by more than 30%. Well, yeah, and the question is, where's that 30% spending gone to? Who's benefited from that? Well, the military-industrial complex. They talk about the imaginary China threat is inflated. Well, it's rather like the imaginary Russian threat to Europe. It's the same principle. Saying that the well-being and stability of Europe suffered. Well, look at it, just what it's done to Germany alone economically. NATO is an obedient executor of NATO's Washington's will, yeah. Cooperation no longer exists and it's been replaced by confrontation, and that stable peace was achieved when the alliance interfered the least. Absolutely. So NATO, and we come back to the whole concept of its Cold War mentality, propaganda of military force, a misguided desire for absolute security, is time for the dustbin of history. Now, and that's the big question ultimately about this, because we come to the final point for me on the as far as this discussion goes, and that's Ukraine itself, because the argument is that could alone consign NATO to the dustbin of history. And it might be consigned not least because Trump gets elected, or there's just a whole change of policy because the United States is not an hegemonic power. And don't assume anything's impossible in this world, because I've seen enough things people said to me were impossible that have happened in the last 5-10 years. So never rule anything out. But I that is a huge risk to the future of NATO. And also, as I say, if the United States does have some idea that it's going to turn its attention to China, which will be a complete failure and a disaster, but if it does, then NATO will cease to exist, because Europe's not going to be trying to contain a Russian threat and a China threat simultaneously. It's not going to be interested in trying to contain China or Russia, for all the reasons we come back to, because the world's very different and they both pose a significant non-military threat. Forget the military component, and that's a statement of the obvious. And I'm not saying Europe can't pose a threat to, well, not so much China, but why would it? But certainly with regards to Russia. But then even its nuclear weapons it has on its soil, it can't use them. The Americans have to use them. They don't have permission to defend themselves. They only have permission to defend themselves when the Americans say, we're going to allow you to defend yourself. And even then, that's not strictly true, because the Americans have to push buttons to fire weapons. So that's a kind of sort of idiotic sort of nature of what NATO ultimately stands for. So I think overall there are many aspects to this. It's tried to truncate it into 2 episodes. The broad points, there's a lot of other points that need to be assessed, but this is why I think the idea that Cold War 2.0 is an extension of the Cold War 1.0 is totally misguided, and this is where history absolutely doesn't rhyme, because the world's a very different place. China is not China of the 1960s. Russia isn't the Russia of the 1960s. And critically, and more importantly, the United States and Europe is not those nations of the 1960s. And in China and Russia's case, they've made huge strides forward, particularly in the last 20 years or so. And the West has been in terminal decline. And I would say arguably particularly in the last 20 years or so, and after the complete failure of the dot-com era. And then, of course, on to Lehman, etc. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed this. It's about trying to stimulate thoughts and ideas and to make people question the narrative where it's appropriate. And that even the narrative in the alt media, and just to stimulate some kind of debate that the world is very different. So we need to think differently about what concepts like the Cold War mean.
Absolutely. Anyway, Paul, thank you as always for the great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here supporting us at the Sirius Report community, thank you for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. And until the next time we get together, everyone, have a great day.